All right. Thank you guys for tuning in today. The training that you are watching is ethical considerations for working with marginalized populations. So thank you guys if you're tuning in for live chat. Please remember to sign in. We often have people that we weren't aware were watching sometimes. And it's always best if you do join and join in some of the comments and questions. Because we definitely want to hear from you guys and interact with you guys, because I think we can all learn more together that way. You guys hear me talk a lot, but there's so many great brains out there in our clinical world, my colleagues and friends out there across Oklahoma, and really like to learn with you guys. So if you guys will participate, we will know that you're there. And I always kind of like to hear from like what city you're watching from, because we do have people watching from kind of around here close where we're at, but then also we have people watching us in different parts of our state. I've lived in different parts of the state and have friends and colleagues everywhere. So hello everybody, it's great to have you guys with us. So today it is good for ethics, and so I have to say ethics, I think every 12 minutes for it to count, so you guys help me remember to do that, of course. Thanks to my man Travis, a key member of the team here, helping clean it up, whatever I'm able to give him as far as the way this looks and sounds. He makes it look and sound a lot better to give to you guys, so I appreciate him a lot, Travis Kelly, and I hope that he's putting his in the credits, his information, his Travis Kelly Productions or whatever, because he can help make good stuff. So and we've got a surprise today also. We're going to have a guest presenter, one of my friends and colleagues, Mr. William White. So I'll be introducing you guys to him for the first time here in just a little while. So super psyched to have my bro helping out on this one, because he's got some important knowledge, wisdom, and expertise to share on this topic as well. And so this is a topic I think that has represented itself again and again with increasing significance. The topic of people mattering less in our society, I feel like in many ways has regressed. So we're going to have some tough discussions today. Some of you guys may like me more and some of you guys may like me less, but the truth shouldn't be controversial. And I don't know how it has become, such a controversial thing to talk about true things. And so one thing that I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to be as moderate about the way I speak about these topics, because if you ever notice in the news, sometimes there is news that is read in a really angry voice, and I feel like that is kind of telling us how to feel in a way, because so much of our communication, they say up to 85% of our communication is nonverbal, so it is how we look and how we sound. So I'm going to try not to tell you how to feel about what's happening in our world and what's led us up to where we're at right now. But we're truth tellers here at New View Healing Solutions, and you guys are truth tellers and truth seekers. So thanks again. For people who are tuning in perhaps for the first time, I do want to tell you guys about our organization just a little bit. You found your way to our website, so thank you for being here. I'm really proud of this little organization that we have going. We're about to complete our 4th year of operation. Can you believe it's been 4 years, Will? Yeah, 4 years. And Travis, you've been on board for some of the last legs of this journey, but it's not the last legs, it's the most recent legs, I guess. And we're super stoked to have you with us. But I was a part of one of Oklahoma's first trauma grants, and I fell into that position. I didn't write it or seek it out. I was really pretty green in the field myself, and so but we did some really good things. I feel like we improved some things measurably in the facilities that we got to implement some of that resource and some of that information. So was proud to get to participate in that. And then the grant ended, and then I didn't get to train people anymore. I just had to do the clinical work, and I love the clinical work. That's the nuts and bolts. So that's the meat of what we're talking about. I'm proud to continue to be a full-time clinician. I am not a professional talker, which I think is probably apparent at times. I don't read to you any cue cards or anything. So so my conversations with you guys and my discussions will be kind of spontaneous. We do have slides, but you guys know I am vision impaired, so I won't be reading those to you. I did write most of them, so I will be able to kind of talk with you about what is there. But NewView Healing Solutions, I work for the Department of Mental Health full time, and I'm proud to work there. So hi to my DMH family and friends. I'm not on the clock today. We're recording this here on a Sunday. So and I love my role within the department, but I wanted to do more. Like I said, the grant was over, but the needs of our state were still great. And so I've been to some really neat training. I've had some really excellent training opportunities, and I felt it my duty to continue to share that with my communities in my state. And I've been to some great trauma training. I'm not the only one out here providing it. There's some good stuff out there. And then there's some stuff that's, I think, falling short of informing trauma, and helping people heal. So some of it's just saying the word a bunch of times and checking the box and meeting the mandate or whatever, so we can say we covered it in policy and procedure or whatever. And we want to make trauma training that's real, accessible, affordable. And we started doing it in rural communities, as you guys know. Some of you that have been with us for a while. We started doing this all in different communities throughout our state. The pandemic forced us to go online. We're hoping to get back into our communities soon. Online may continue to be a presence. It's helped us, I think, reach more of you guys that way as well. So we're thankful for that. But we want to make training that helps you help people. Because this is really life or death for a lot of our patients, our clients, our students, and so we obviously we train mental health professionals, but it makes it free to the larger communities. One of our big projects is kind of one of the trainings that some of you guys have seen with us, called Changing ACEs Where You Are, and that's going to be our last live chat for the year, because I believe for us it begins and ends with changing ACEs, and each one of us can have a role, and you guys are already on board with that. But one of the things that we want to do is we want to share that information with other caring adults, other people who can make a difference, who are safe adults, because any safe adult can make a difference, can help a child accept themselves, love themselves, forgive themselves for being injured. And so we're asking that if you know of anyone that doesn't necessarily need a CEU, because we're doing okay as far as getting people to get our CEU, but we want to get that information to people who are free, motivated learners, who can just make a difference and have a heart for helping kids. So if you know of anyone that would benefit from that, we hope you will share. One of our big initiatives is training all schools and all law enforcement in the state for free, and you guys are helping us do that with the support you provide, and just making us feel like, I guess, we are doing something here. Oklahoma has been up to #1 in the nation for ACEs. It's not okay. Some measures have us at 3. I'm not going to say that NewView fixed it. I believe we are contributing to good things like you guys are. And so thank you guys for supporting what we do, and tell people who don't need to see you, who are not necessarily going to give us money. We want people who just want to learn this stuff. So, and certainly we appreciate you guys getting your continuing education with us also. So if you are a senior, I just want to remind folks, seniors 65 plus, veterans and state employees do get 25% off of our already low cost, because we want to thank you guys for your service, your wisdom, and all you've already contributed to this field. So please make sure that you enter that discount code, and if you forget, tell me, I'll send you a check. Because we really do appreciate you guys a lot for doing that. So, but that's it. Oh yeah, and we are going to still offer training in 2022, but we are going to really focus a lot on our training for the schools and for for police, and also our development of the injured parenting program, or healing injured parenting. So really looking forward to doing more with you guys on that. So anyway, thanks a lot. Let's jump right in to some important stuff to talk about today. So Will's right, no one ever said it would be easy. I feel like, as social workers, as LPCs, as LMFTs, as case managers, as teachers, heck, as police officers, as so many of the people that go into our communities and try to help, it seems like the problems are so many, so vast, so immense, so complicated and complex. It's just like, it can be pretty overwhelming sometimes, and I feel like sometimes we can kind of glaze to that and say, yeah, but well, what are you going to do? Well, that's why, I call you guys in our correspondence and in our communications mental health heroes. I mean that with every syllable, because you guys say, well, we got to do something, and nobody ever said it was going to be easy, and we've got to remind ourselves that when we are discouraged, when we are frustrated, and we can't let the work wear on us too much. We've got to stay where clients and patients and students need us to be. And so I'm inspired. I find inspiration in different things, and I think it's important to do that. But I remember words from people like Kennedy, and he talked about going to the moon, and how hard, what a difficult challenge that will be. I won't try to remember and butcher the words of someone greater than I, but he talked about how hard it was going to be. And we choose to do these things because it's hard. And at what point, and when has it ever been worthwhile to do the easy things? I mean, it's nice when something that we need to do, something important, it doesn't challenge us too much, but also lifting light weights doesn't give you big muscles, and of course we need that for cardio and everything. That's a different discussion. But anyway, so we choose to do what we do to try to change the world and heal the world and advocate for social justice, and it is hard, but again, the hard things, I think, are the most necessary, significant, and worthwhile. So we'll just jump right in and talk more about it. Yeah, so this is an interesting history. You guys, some of you have heard me talk about this before, and so I'm going to talk about it a little differently today, or I'm going to try to see how it comes out. We first obviously discovered trauma and kind of acknowledged it among war veterans and soldiers. These were, typically males that were having difficulty both during war and most commonly post to their trauma. And so the common symptom, the most easily noticed symptom, other than being emotionally troubled, was this exaggerated startle response. There was lots of cannons, guns, bombs going off, so their nerves were very injured in that way. So we understood trauma to mean lots of loud noises, and that doesn't necessarily always, that's not always the case. But women and children also had trauma, of course. But that wasn't often acknowledged. Now, one of the things that we notice now, war is fighting for one's country. In the early wars, it's certainly been indoctrinated as something that's very noble. It's a valor. So if you got hurt defending your country, there wasn't a lot of shame in that. Of course, not until, some of the guys coming home from the Vietnam War, who were only doing what they were told, of course. A lot of them were called baby killers and everything. They weren't necessarily welcomed home or whatever. But anyway, women and children started showing up with trauma, of course, and that was only because we started being allowed to talk about it, because to be harmed in your home, it went with a lot of stigma, a lot of shame, and it wasn't something that the community was really open to talking about. And so we obviously, I'll ask you guys again, do you guys remember how the first case of child abuse was prosecuted in the United States of America? I'll give you guys a moment for the chat if you're going to join in on that. Some of you guys have already probably answered that before, but you're correct if you answered that animal protection laws were in place before child protection laws and spouse protection laws. And so you were allowed to beat your kids and your spouse, your wife, at a certain point, because they were considered more like property. And if you did seek help from someone in the community, you were often sent back to your abusers. There was not shelters. There was not places where women and children could go. They didn't have money. So you were not a captive, but you were kind of on an island anyway, very much dependent upon your abuser. And so you guys are familiar with the rule of thumb law? Or it wasn't, it was often spoken of as a law, but it was not actually a law. It was a legal precedent. You guys familiar with what that meant? Because you hear it in common phrases and discussion today, sometimes as a rule of thumb. And I initially wasn't aware of where that came from. But a judge had decreed when a man had hurt his wife too much, beating her with something was wider than his thumb, a club or a stick or a bat or who knows, women were being harmed in their homes and at the hands of their partners. And so a judge didn't say, you can't beat your wife, stop beating your wife, stop hurting, a person in your home. What they said is you can still beat them, but with nothing wider than your thumb. And so, again, we know that in bad neighborhoods and in war and, different places, it's going to be dangerous and scary, but it does a special kind of harm to us when we're not safe in our home, where we're supposed to be safe. So it really impresses upon our system and our norms that we're not safe. And so, and I think we have to kind of go back a little bit further. Women and children have certainly been a marginalized population, and that persists in our society. Going back further, we look at the massacre, decimation of the native population. The early settlers and adventurers and different people, Columbus and different people came to this place and saw how rich it was in resources, and so this land was basically taken from the native people, and they were concentrated in different areas that got smaller and smaller and further west as more and more Europeans moved over across the continent. And so the native culture has been largely decimated. They were, allowed to exist on, less fertile and less abundant lands. And a lot of times there was, again, boarding houses and so many different mechanisms in place. Kids were taken away from their families, taught to speak only white, English languages. They were not allowed to speak their native tongue or, engage in any of their traditional practices or dress. And so they basically tried to beat and train and educate and assimilate the native out of the child. And of course, that was a brutal process. We're seeing now in different places where there are these mass graves where children were clearly something terrible was happening with kids in some of these boarding houses and places where they were taken away from their families. And children in some of the Canadian boarding houses and Catholic church type schools, children would run away into the freezing wilderness to die of cold rather than be there, because they just wanted to be home with their families. And so the native people have continued to struggle. And I feel like very few of us have ever been on a reservation to really know what that's like. And so I feel like it's kind of out of sight and out of mind. And so we know that our country and much of the wealth of our country was built upon slavery. You know, early Americans, this was a common practice, you know, in different parts of the world, not just America. So we can't, you know, play a particular, you know, we're not going to vilify ourselves any more than necessary, but it was a brutal and horrible practice of owning people and forcing them to work, and of course breaking up families and different things. And one of the things that I, you know, can kind of recall is the Bible, you know, was, I believe, quoted at different times and manipulated to try to justify some of these harms to people, some of these different ways of not only marginalizing but brutalizing fellow human beings. Because, of course, the Bible says the man's the boss of the family, you know, and he's supposed to, you know, tell his women and kids what to do. You know, that sort of thing. And it was also true that it said man was given domain over the birds in the air and the fish in the sea and the beasts of the field. And of course, African American people, human beings, were called beasts. And so that justified ownership of them. And so it's interesting how the good book can be used to do such a bad thing. We also know that the good book is, of course, one of our foundational pieces. It's very influential in American society, along with medical practice. Two of the most influential books in America have been the medical book, the diagnostic manual, and the Bible. And so another instance where biblical scripture has perhaps been manipulated to harm is when it deals with how we consider gay and lesbian people, because that was often traditionally viewed as a sin. And I don't speak for God, and so I'm not going to say what is or what is not, but some passages and some interpretations of that passage means that adult is not supposed to lay with child. And so there are different interpretations of that. But whatever your interpretation is, we can't allow for an interpretation that allows for some people's rights to be less or for them to be harmed or less safe. Because that's the reality. You know, in America, some people are less safe. You know, I love my country. I consider myself to be a patriot. You know, and sometimes I wonder, I've wondered this aloud before. I'm a straight white guy, and I kind of wonder, am I allowed to, is this appropriate for me to talk about these kind of things? But I think, well, there are some people that will only listen to other white men. And so I'm hopeful that I can use my voice to contribute to good things, because I think I don't want to play any white savior role. I think we all have a role in contributing to moving our society forward, because I think we're moving backward. And there's a lot of reasons why, and we can kind of break that down a little bit when it's productive. So I think a straight white guy can talk about this, and I'm going to try to do my best and to not upset anybody. But liberty and justice for all is what we stand for. And you know, growing up as a little kid, I think it can be easy to, you know, see, you know, everybody's free and everything's equal, right? You know, and I live in a great place, and you know, Ronald Reagan's president, and everything, happy America. You know, it's easy to grow up blind, and that's not wrong. But it is wrong to not search and to look for ways that we can use where we are in life to help others be safe, equal, and free. So that's what we're going to try to talk about today. We're going to make it good for ethics. And so those are some kind of foundational historical pieces, and we're going to continue to talk about how we got here. You know, because I feel like that's relevant in understanding, you know, where we are and how we address the issues that present today. So, what's next? Okay, so, you know, I'm from the Tulsa area, and I graduated in Broken Arrow, And they didn't tell us about the Tulsa race massacre. I had heard loose references to a riot, you know, and that was certainly minimized, downplayed, and nearly forgotten, you know, I think to history it seemed, you know. Some bad people nearly got away with it. And so, you know, I'll tell you guys what, you know, I'm familiar with. But of course it happened in 1921. A young black man named Emmett, I believe was his name. What was his last name? Anyway, a young man allegedly made a pass at or assaulted a white woman in an elevator, a young white woman who was operating an elevator. And so what happened next was he was arrested and charged, and mobs of white people came to lynch. And now the African American community came to his aid, believing him innocent, a good young man, and not guilty of this crime, and certainly at least wanted to hope for him to have a fair legal process, which of course is laughable. But so then they had two groups of people, white people and black people, and emotions were running high. And so what ended up happening was the city of Tulsa and government officials supplied guns and ammunition to the white crowd to, I guess, help with crowd control, considering the black folks there to be an angry mob. And so they were driven back with violence. And so, but they didn't stop there. So they burned every home and structure for I forget how many city blocks. And so they believe as many as 300 or more men, women, and children were massacred. And it was just that, it was a massacre. And I think it's important for us to understand when we think about long-lasting generational impacts, because that was terrible, but there were all kinds of roadblocks to rebuilding. For those of you who are familiar with the Tulsa area, it was considered, it was called Black Wall Street. It was one of the wealthiest, most affluent black communities in the United States of America. It's now North Tulsa. And North Tulsa, I think, has made some progress, but has been a very impoverished, high crime. It's been a ghetto, and so to think about, you know, 100 years later, a community that was wealthy that is not. Think about all the people that would have had businesses, that they would have passed those on, homes that they would have passed on. You know, homes are one of the best ways that we can sustain and pass on wealth through our family. And so a lot of families were denied that. And so, you know, I believe that they commissioned an investigation about that in 1997. What, 56 years? 56 years after murder. In what world? I mean, because it was apparent. I mean, you can look at the picture, bad things happened. But, of course, when those in power don't wish to help, or in fact want to participate in that harm, there's a real danger out there that many of us couldn't possibly comprehend. And so in 1997, they commissioned the investigation. They released a report a few years later. And why do you think that it took over 60 years for us to get any information, any truth at all? I think it's because a lot of murdering grandpas had a chance to shuffle off into hell, you know. And so that maybe that's a strong statement to make. But make no mistake about it, there were people that believed in killing men, women, and children because of the color of their skin. And those people had children and grandchildren, and you can bet they were a strong influence in their family, because the man was the boss. And so anyway, it's just something that I feel kind of cheated as far as my educational process growing up in the Tulsa area to not have known, things that have happened in streets that I've been down. And I think that we can kind of understand some of the reasons why we were denied this truth. And why, there's a lot of African American people that didn't even know that, because it was a truth that was stamped out, nearly stamped out. So, but anyway, that was 100 years ago, and we're regressing as a society. We got a kid going out of state with a machine gun strapped to his chest, brought there by his mother, and the judge is yelling at the prosecutor. Again, the kid was there to defend property, but again, if you go up to somebody and point a machine gun at them, who isn't going to grab it and try to push it away? Boom, you've got a reason to shoot them now. If we don't get justice for some of these things soon, I think we're in big trouble as a society, because we are regressing. If people can chase a guy down for jogging in a neighborhood, corner him, and then when he decides to try to get away or fight back, to gun him down in cold blood. I mean, again, these things are still pending and alleged or whatever, but we're regressing in a society, and we've had a president that's forgiven it, accepted it, and given it the nod. And so anyway, it's hard to think about, because I've never had to experience that lack of safety based on my gender or race, but I know people who have. I had a friend, he's given me permission to talk about this, but I have a friend who played basketball at OU back in the 70s, and got to travel all over the country, and see, different parts of the country and play basketball, meet, people. And of course, he went to states like Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana, and got to go to a party in one of those states, and went to the bathroom, and somebody grabbed him by his afro and put a shotgun to the back of his head and told him that they were going to blow his brains out, because he was a young man that wanted to come to a party, but there was white girls there, and this wasn't 200 years ago. This is in our lifetime. These are people that live and breathe and that have children and grandchildren, and so think about all the values, all the experiences, all the learned fears and beliefs that you have come up with all over across your life, and what you teach your kids based on, what has affected you and what has been normal for you. So anyway.
To get educated.
Why?
So you can go to college.
And why is that important?
To get respect.
Respect. And who's the bad guys?
Guys who sell drugs.
The guys who have guns.
And who's the good guys?
We're the good guys.
Who's gonna help you?
Nobody.
So who's gonna help?
We're gonna help ourselves.
And who do we not want to help us?
White people.
That's right. And get on out of here. Go to school.
So, I wanted to show that clip. A lot of people, I know white people that would think, well, these they're racist. They're teaching racism to their kids. No, they're teaching survival to their kids. Because if you have been harmed by somebody, or your friends or your family have been harmed based on a racial premise, based on being less safe in your community, in your country, your liberty and justice not being quite as equal as all, then you teach survival skills. There's a lot of black families that have to specifically teach their kids how to interact with the police, how to try not to get gunned down by the police. How many white families have to tell their kids how to interact with police, not to get shot? Is that a reality for you, those of you watching that have children, have young men, have sons? Do you have to coach them on how not to get killed by the police? Because a lot of us, we live in such separate realities, and we forget to consider the experience that is outside of our own. And that's how harm is perpetuated. And so, what slide are we on, gentlemen?
We're on the early mistakes.
Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit just to kind of bring you up to speed on how we kind of got to where we're at. I'm not going to give you a historical perspective on on treatment. I think that I just want to give you some kind of highlights that would be laughable in some instances if they weren't so harmful to people, and in some instances fatal to people. And so there's a lot of trust given to people in white coats. People have letters behind their names and certificates on the wall. We're some of those people. So we have to move very cautiously and ethically. It was 12 minutes, it was time. So looking back though, they had the phrenology. You could feel on somebody's heads and the contours of, the head was going to tell you something about their personality. This guy had a lot of really early success with feeling around on the heads of family and friends of his own and telling us things about their personalities, and he was pretty accurate in telling us personality traits of his own friends and family members based on, I guess, the bumps on their head or whatever. And that's all ridiculous and laughable. But of course, phrenology was adopted by Nazis and Hitler. And of course, ridiculous practices such as this were used to justify harm of people. And of course, so as ridiculous as it sounds, I think it's important to remember, history like that. We know about Sigmund Freud, who, contributed a lot, was viewed by some, called the father of modern psychology, is what he had been nicknamed at one point. I don't know if he still gets to have that name based on some of what we know now. I don't think Sigmund Freud was out there intentionally trying to do harm. I think that he was a product of his day. I think he had an ego and said, by golly, I know stuff and I'm going to try stuff. But he certainly coined the term hysteria. Women were hysterical when they were struggling emotionally. Now, again, women, a lot of these women had been sexually assaulted. They had less rights, less freedom, and so anyone that's not safe can be hysterical at times. But hyster is the root of that word, which refers to a female's anatomy. It's saying that you ladies are crazy because of your lady parts. And of course, we know that's ridiculous, and I don't mean to be crude or crass about that, but that's what Sigmund Freud, a very influential figure, was teaching and saying to people. And of course, in a patriarchal society, that has a lingering echoes. Because women are still called, they're just a hysterical woman, and it's used to perhaps minimize her emotions or her concerns. And so we know about institutionalization and deinstitutionalization, the great pendulum swinging, because we locked everybody up, we took away, sometimes we sterilized people. If they were deemed incompetent or whatever, there's a slippery slope and some discussion that could be had there. But we used to take away the rights and freedoms of people that struggle with a wide variety of mental health disorders, some of which did not require that level of care and loss of freedom. And restriction. And so, and then they did the deinstitutionalization movement, which got largely lots of people out of the institutionalizations, emptied the hospitals, emptied the beds, and put a lot of people into the community that really weren't safe and didn't have the skills, the ability, the competence to be okay. And so we saw huge numbers of homeless populations rise, and of course, there was a lot of problems, with that population, then having, children of their own and struggling to care for those. And that's not to say that mental illness makes you mean you can't parent. It does present some special challenges when it is SMI, severe mental illness. So anyway, I think it's important for us to remember things like that. We've got implanted memories and hypnosis used in therapy. And of course, if you follow your kind of clinical history there. That was, disproven as a functional therapeutic method, and in some instances it was used to implant false memories of sexual abuse at the hands of family members that didn't happen, that people sometimes killed themselves over when accused, tore families apart. And so I can only imagine if sexual abuse didn't happen, how or why somebody would implant that memory, but somebody perhaps projecting some of their own experience. It can be really easy to assume that what's happened to us and within our reality is kind of just, that's everybody's reality. We rationally know that's not true, but sometimes we operate with that rationale sometimes. So there's rebirthing. Oh wait, I missed one of the things on there, and I want to thank my daughter. She's such a sharp kid, and she helps me input some of the data and helps me review it. And she said, well, you've got to have conversion camps on here, Dad. And I said, yeah, I do, because they're still a thing. It sounds, like something that you would only find in the 1950s. But yeah, there are camps where you can still take your kid and just have them traumatized, and because we know that sexual orientation, a lot of it has to do with the way our brain develops. And so it's teaching kids to reject a part of themselves and to try to convert something that's not. It's not a disease or an illness or something that needs to be treated, but has often been treated as such. And so conversion camps, that's a way of saying, you're not like us, so we need to make you like us because, you don't fit our norm and our familiarity and our code of morality or whatever. And so, so these are things that have kind of been along the journey of how us clinicians came to be clinicians, and that road that has informed our knowledge. Because knowledge is very foundational. We learn from someone who learned from someone who learned from someone who learned from someone. And so, so we kind of have to be aware of how we came to be where we are. What's the last bullet on there, Will?
So the last one is rebirthing.
Ah, yes, okay. And so, and that's something that sounds like it would have been 100 years ago. Rebirthing, You ever heard of rebirthing, Travis? Okay, well hold on tight, because rebirthing, Travis, was a process where they were going to reduce or eliminate or address different types of developmental or mental health disorders by reenacting birth, by constructing a canal and forcing maybe a child as early, as late as 8, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 years old through a birthing process. And it actually killed a kid. They were smothered a kid to death in pillows and blankets, squeezing them like a uterus. And this happened in the 1990s, and they filmed it. They filmed it. And again, these were, and they lost their license and they went to jail. They killed a kid on video. Now, do you think they would have videotaped it in their office in a professional setting if they thought they were doing something wrong? Somebody taught them this, And they said, yes, that sounds like a good idea. Let's, even though you can't, it seems so ludicrous knowing what we know about how our brain and our body develops. You can't revisit those windows of development. But that's what professional people were practicing as late as the 1990s. And so I think it's important and relevant because some of our laws and some of our practices are just as goofy and just as harmful and surprisingly recent. And some of them are still happening. So let's talk about this. How am I doing? I haven't gotten too worked up yet, guys. Have I? Have I kept it toned down? Okay, because again, I'm trying not to tell you guys how to feel about fact. And this stuff isn't because Jeremy said so. I really encourage you guys to be informed about truth because it's becoming something of a rarer commodity these days. Things like substance abuse. I would say that the substance abuse population could be considered a marginalized population. If you were suicidal, that was something that wasn't okay. That was a sin and a weakness and a flaw in your character. Even though if you had more to deal with than others that were judging you could ever understand. And so, and being gay, these were considered sin, wrong, weakness. And so, now, when we say that something is bad, you know, that's one of the things I've often said, I don't know what bad kids are. These kids are being bad. Well, what does bad mean? Bad is not very scientific. Now, if I call it bad, I can be mad at it, though, or I can judge it, I can punish it, I can criticize it. You know, you don't feel so bad about, you know, being less humane or supportive to people who are bad. But, and so, and we didn't get to understand the struggles of people because these labels and these judgments. And of course, you know, oh, I'm bad, I'm a weak, terrible, bad, flawed sinner. So yes, please come and study me and maybe take away my rights and my freedoms and my property while you're at it. You know, please come and understand my plight a little more. No. And so it wasn't, in fact, if you had committed suicide, the Christian church could take your stuff up until about the 5th century. You know, they could take your property. If you were a wealthy person and you know, threw in the towel in life for whatever reason, you couldn't even give your property, your home, your assets to the church. So now I can see some motivation there. It seems like there's so many of those those dollars, those monetary motivators, you know, at work and things like this. Now, it wasn't until there were some softening views of the Christian church that did allow for people to start to come to speak of and address their problems. And it did lead to a bit more humane treatment and in some instances some more effective treatment and outcomes. But if we deem it a sin, just say it's a sin. And again, believe what you believe. I'm not going to tell you to govern your morals. But if we're worried about what's a sin in our clinical sessions, we've got a problem. Because we're not there to treat their soul. We are there to treat their mental health needs. And their learning needs and their medical needs and their and so anyway, I'm certainly, when I think about gay and lesbian, different non-binary orientations, I want to not act like they're just one monolith, you know. I have a burgeoning kind of understanding. We kind of have to kind of grow and learn with the times, so I'm still kind of in my curve there. But I'll certainly acknowledge that. But love's all you need, you know. You know, somebody said that. Love is all you need. Isn't that right? It's John Lennon. Yeah. So, first I want to introduce you guys a little more thoroughly to my colleague Will. I told you guys at the beginning of the training he was going to be sharing some things with you guys today. So I just want to tell you he is a social worker and he's going to have his license soon. And he, Will White, somebody I've known for a number of years. He's a good friend and colleague, has some great knowledge and experience, and so he's going to share some of that with you guys a little bit more thoroughly than I can now. And like I said, give you guys a break from looking and hearing my voice and mug. So anyway, welcome, Will. Glad to have you with us.
Okay, so hi, I'm Will. Thanks, Jeremy. Anyways, so
welcome, Will.
I'm here to tell you a little bit about Stonewall, which was a gay bar in New York City, and it was established in 1966, I believe, by the mafia, who were using it, you know, as a place to get money because, you know, since you're the mafia, that's kind of the only people that can associate with, you know, the evil, morally corrupt gay people, because they're the only ones that are going to let them operate a bar. Because I believe that, this bar did not even have a liquor license because the city wouldn't grant them one because they knew what, was going on there, I guess. But anyways, there's been kind of a history in the 50s and 60s of gay Americans being targeted anyway, just because of the whole anti-communist thing that was happening in the early 50s and early 60s. A lot of homosexual people were, prosecuted under that for morals crimes or suspected of, being communist because people believed that, because they might try and hide their sexual orientation, they'd be easier to turn by the Russians. So that's kind of the history of why, police and the FBI at that time were so concerned with gay people. But anyways, we'll get to the actual event, Stonewall. That occurred on June 28th, 1969 at the Stonewall Inn and Bar. And so what normally happened about every month is the police would raid the bars, and the standard procedure was, the bars generally would know in advance when they were being raided because, people would leak that information from the police or whatever else.
The police were pretty crooked.
Yeah,
They were there for a shakedown, right?
Yeah, basically they were there just for a shakedown because they knew they could, get their cash and arrest people since this wasn't an actual functioning bar. In fact, the bar didn't even have running water. It had to, they had to get their water from elsewhere. But anyways, so the police come in, lights come on, people are asked to identify themselves as they would have been at that time. And, instead of complying and, being arrested for, being gay or being dressed in drag, not associating, your dress with your gender, people would be arrested for that. Normally, some of the patrons, as long as they were not, dressed in drag, might be let go. Some of them were arrested, but on this particular night, June 28th, people kind of started refusing to line up and, identify themselves, and gradually a crowd started to grow. There was probably about 150 people outside, in a matter of like 30 minutes maybe after the police started raiding the bar. From what I was reading, there were probably 3 or 4 times as many people outside, instigating the police than there were, that the police actually arrested. So, this is kind of in a gay area of town anyway, so there's lots of people from that community around. And so, eventually enough is enough, and I think people just decided that they were tired of that.
Didn't they pelt them with coins?
Yeah, they threw all kinds of stuff. They were throwing glass, coins, ashtrays, chairs, different stuff back and forth at each other for hours. It went on actually for 2 days, I believe. And, it just grew larger and larger, basically. More people from the community kind of started coming to rally around this bar. And so, that to many people in the gay and lesbian and transgender and, queer identifying communities is kind of the start of, the gay rights movement. And so the thing that happens also after Stonewall is that, people are empowered. People realize, hey, I don't have to, just submit to all this harassment by police for just being myself. And so the year anniversary after that happened, people gathered on Christopher Street where the Stonewall Inn was and began to, form an assembly and marched down, the street, stopping traffic. And that was the first gay pride parade, essentially. And they also had simultaneous demonstrations in Chicago and Los Angeles, I believe, in 1970. And that's kind of what started the whole gay rights, gay pride movement.
What do you think that did, Will, for kids all over the country that said, wow, that had this within them but weren't safe?
I mean, I think for some of those kids it was probably, a realization that they could get out of their circumstances. But of course, at that time, if you're some kid in rural Oklahoma hearing about that, on the news or on the radio or whatever else, you may not have a lot of options to get out of where you are at that time.
They probably weren't talking about it very favorably on the news.
Yeah, and I would imagine that,
If at all.
it probably either wasn't talked about or it was talked about, as a riot and, as people that were communist and traitors and all that stuff. There was probably all kinds of negative language used about them. But I do think that the gay pride, movement and the marches and that kind of stuff gave young people hope. And I think that also that first, movement kind of spurred on other movements all across the country. Actually, in the 1970s, there were some large movements to try and revisit some of the things that were being used to discriminate against gay and lesbian people. Several cities actually passed like non-discrimination ordinances during that time, which, I believe some of them were later overturned, later in the 80s when we got Ronald Reagan and we started being all moral and Christian and patriotic or whatever else,
I don't think it's about being, people are deceived. People want to be patriotic. People want to be moral. People who want to follow their faith. But I think sometimes those notions get confused.
Yeah, but I mean, you've had people that are being told, it's a good thing to go find the local homosexual and turn him into your, police department or whatever else for the good of your, your country. Which, was of course a lie. But I do think that it had a long-lasting effect, and it's the reason that most gay pride parades now occur in June, because we want to remember that initial movement that then sparked other movements later on. So yeah, that's what I got to say about that, pretty much.
Thanks, Will. We're going to see you more in a little bit, aren't we?
You shall.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Will. Will's gonna come back and talk with us more about some different things that he's helped with the research on, things that he's kind of helped and informed me upon, and so I appreciate his knowledge and his input. And plus, you guys get tired of hearing just me. And as always, we're welcoming people that want to come and share, that have passions and things that they feel are important. We want to welcome you guys. But what Will was saying, people need to be able to have pride. People need to be able to have community. And these were things that, and if it didn't affect you, then you didn't worry about it. And so if somebody went out and beat up the queers, locally, that wasn't something that, people felt too badly about, because again, suicide, substance abuse, being, non-binary gender or orientation, these were things that were bad anyway. So a lot of people, when they seen brutal things happening to the local gay person, they said, yeah, that's what they get, a lot of times. And so it reminds me of a story that I will share with you guys. A person that I knew growing up, their dad was telling us, who he came from the different part of the country, old guy, and it was common, him and his buddies, sounded like he had some pretty bad little group of buddies, but they would go out and do what they called rolled queers. It was rolling queers, is what he said. And that's where they would go into a gay bar and get them riled up and be waiting outside to jump them and beat them up. And so, and so he told us this story, and of course, I guess they had done this a few times or whatever. But this one particular night, they'd gone and done this, and they were hitting these gay men over the head with 2x4s as they would walk out of the bar. You know, real manly thing to do. You know. And so that's how they were getting their kicks. And one guy, they hit over his head. It was a little bald guy, and he went down, and the board broke. And he got up and said, "There's only one thing I like better than I won't repeat." He goes, and that's a good fight. And he commenced to beating the snot out of all of them. And so, and I thought that was a very there was some justice in that story, because they were doing harm. And harm that clearly no one cared about. And of course, one of the things that we've often been taught that gay people are not tough, they're not manly. This guy was all the man they could handle and then some. And they got what they had coming to them. So but let's think about pre-logic learning, about how we get our values on people. Because, as we want to be emotionally intelligent, and I've often talked about our brain as this cognitive cookie jar, and when we're growing up, our brain is like all these different metaphors. Our brain's also like a vacuum, and it's taking in whatever's around. It's sucking it up, the data, whatever's around, and whatever cookie are placed into that cookie jar. This is how we feel about certain things. This is how we feel about those people or those, and so that's the data that we have to access. And so, and I think it's important for us to understand that our values on, of course, how children are supposed to be treated, on how men and women treat each other, on how we treat the elderly, how we treat the people with disabilities or with mental illness or different races of people or genders or orientations of people. A lot of it is not what we learn in grade school or middle school or high school. A lot of it is in a time that's pre-logic. And what I mean pre-logic is it's not when we're thinking, what really makes sense? What's the best way to think and feel and believe? It's when we're doing what people say so, When somebody tells you, when you're little, you believe that a guy's going to come down your chimney, a big fat guy, or sneak into your apartment with bags full of toys. You believe it because somebody told you so. And we believe in certain things because we're told to believe them, and we don't question that. And there's some of those beliefs that are a little bit less harmless than Santa Claus, that do linger, and they're passed from generation to generation in that pre-logic time, because we got policies and procedures and we got laws that say you're not supposed to abuse your kids, and that racism and slavery and all these things are bad and gone, and we've got a lot of things. Men are no longer supposed to hit their wives and oppress women and stuff like that. That's but I think it's important for us to tackle this at some really early roots. There's a lot of different ways to combat these different forms of marginalization, but a lot of it is about preventing what I would call detrimental familiarities. We got to guard the data that's going into little brains, because by the time we get to grade school and middle school and high school, there's a lot of pretty hardwired connections made in our brain, and a lot of instilled beliefs that are there, not because they're necessarily logical, rational, or moral, but they're there because they're familiar. And so we've got to guard against dysfunctional norms or detrimental familiarities. So you guys were wondering when I was going to define trauma. And so, but trauma is the really bad thing that happens to us. I define this differently every time. And so, but our emotions, and our pain that happens in our body, this is a system of nerve networks that communicate through neurochemical and electrical impulse energy. And so when we experience too much of our body's response to a stimulus, particularly an unpleasant or painful one, then it does leave a lasting impression on our brain and on our body, and it is measurable. Chronic stress is similar. although sometimes it's less noticeable because it's a repeated or ongoing series of events, often over time. And so it's not one big blip on the radar, and it can become quite normalized. It's something, the impacts are similar, but can be a little bit more insidious with a lack of identification. And so, so I think it's important for us to understand marginalization is allowing for some of our fellow Americans and citizens and human beings to be harmed, and for us to care less, for us to invest less or advocate less on behalf of some. And so we've got to kind of understand injuries of trauma first. As ethical treatment providers, we're to do no harm. And I think without understanding traumatic injuries, we can be less helpful, and in some instances we can trigger or be harmful. And so I put some terms up there. Post-traumatic stress, when we meet criteria, for lingering impacts from a trauma, then we call that post-traumatic stress. There's a variety of different anxiety and stressor-related disorders. We have complex PTSD, which is a little more difficult sometimes to diagnose when it comes to specific symptoms and specific processing, because when one really bad thing happened to you and then you were different and you noticed when and why and how you were different, then that was something that it was pretty easy to connect the dots. But when people have layers upon layers of trauma, we don't always understand or even remember when we have physical sensations in our body that are discomfort or anxiety, or we don't always remember why we're thinking and feeling and hurting the way that we do. And so, and also got me to thinking about something. We don't have anything in the diagnosis manual called TSD. We have similar things. Post-traumatic stress disorder is PTSD, but I've often, heard and studied and come to believe that we have to be safe in order for our best functioning, and certainly in order to heal fully and functionally, we have to be safe. So again, I throw some terms out there, conclusive trauma, non-conclusive trauma, because I think in order for it to become post-traumatic stress, it has to be conclusive. We have to be able to end the injury in order to begin to address the injury. But so many problems that we see, I think some of the problems that we see in people struggle to recover from are because it's only TSD, it's traumatic stress disorder, it's non-conclusive trauma. And so that's making for, a lot of, it would probably register as complex PTSD, or depending on which day you diagnose it, could be depression, or it could be anxiety, or it could be mood swings, it could be a lot of different things, So anyway, what we've got to do is help people achieve safety, because our ethics require it, certainly, but people who are not getting better, this is part of the reason why, because they're not achieving the safety, they're not able to conclude their injury. So let's keep going. All kinds of experiences don't end, and when you think about it, a car wreck that comes to an end, and you can hopefully get out of an abusive situation or dynamic with a partner or a family member. You can quit a job, or hopefully move away from a trauma that's happening near you, hopefully. A lot of times it's certainly not so simple. But if you're being black in America, that doesn't seem to be changing or getting a lot better. So that right now seems to be a non-conclusive form of trauma. Being gay, lesbian, transgender, again, these are people who have been traditionally and to this day have less safety, less freedom. And so one of the things, there's a lot of different marginalized groups. Women are still not as safe and equal and free. I've told you guys about a training that I went to once. I think I mentioned it to you guys, but Well, it was a co-ed audience, and they were talking about sexual assault, sexual harassment, and what we do to guard ourselves against being sexually assaulted. And none of the men there had any really clue or consideration for it, because it wasn't a reality we'd had to consider. And so, again, there's all kinds of things, discrimination and oppressions against women, but just thinking about that right there and considering that separate but unequal reality. You know, men kind of, some of them appeared a bit astonished at the realization that, well, they'd never had to think about that. When it's something that you ladies have to think about a lot, what you have to do to not be hurt, not to be victimized in that way. And that's a gender based thing. And, you know, I was just hearing on NPR today how, you know, it was upheld for a long time that if a woman was harmed, you know, specifically based on gender by, you know, sexual assault or whatever, that the Congress and the Supreme Court, they had no place in protecting women. That was, it was agreed to be appalling, but it wasn't something that, you know, they found to be discriminatory. So, I also find certain types of disabilities. As you guys know, I have a vision impairment, and so it's something that progressively happened over time. I was diagnosed as a child, and they said it would happen someday, and I was like, yeah, right. And so it kind of gradually happened over time, and so it reminded me of kind of like this, you know, the old-timey black and white villain movies. He ties somebody to the railroad tracks, and, you know, and he's twisting his mustache, and the, you know, train is coming down the track, and going blind or having, you know, I've known people to have MS or, you know, different types of physical disabilities, and to feel these things gradually coming on and to not be able to do anything about it. I think it's like seeing that train coming at like 2 miles an hour, and there's just not anything you can do to get off the tracks. You know, if you know, you can be in a car accident and that can be a traumatic thing, but what if the car just keeps flipping forever and you never come to a rest and be able to get out of the car? I think for a lot of people that worsening, deteriorating disability state can be something like that. Now, we can still learn ways to be empowered, and I'm fortunate to not have a physically debilitating or painful disorder like some have had to be challenged by. But there's lots of different things, forms of non-conclusive trauma, and these are also things that I think can be pretty synonymous or parallel with the experience of being marginalized. You know, as a vision impaired person, working and being a professional, I've had a lot of good help and support, and I'm really, really thankful for that. But at times I've really had to push and advocate. But people, most of the people I work with have never had a blind professional working with them. So things that don't occur to us just don't occur to us. You know, the realities of my, you know, working and functioning day, that, you know, it's hard for people to consider. Of course, yeah, the obvious things, but some of the day-to-day aspects of being vision impaired, people kind of have to have that experience with somebody in order to kind of know. And I think that takes more people with disabilities joining and the workforce in contributing, because we all have things that we can contribute. So what's next? Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of these post-traumatic stress symptoms. And so, and I'm going to show you some clips from a show, if I can find it, while we're doing this one as well. You know, we know that trauma it is an injury. It does change brain, heart, nervous system. It's a physiological impact, and it does have both cognitive and emotional and physical symptoms. And so treating it is important that way because well, injured people do injured things, and we have to understand injured behaviors instead of bad behaviors. Because, again, bad behaviors are just not very scientific, but it certainly seems to authorize less investment or less support at times. So, but also thinking about the physiological symptoms and hyperarousal, hypervigilance, we're going to talk and think a little bit more about that. But having anxiety, it often turns to agitation, which turns to anger, but it also turns to depression and fatigue. Being anxious and being scared and being worried, it's exhausting. But one of the things that I really am noticing, and at times I feel myself reacting to a little bit, and that's why I think it's really important for me to be emotionally intelligent. I'm just going to be honest with you guys, because I think it's important for us to understand hypervigilance. Some specific and particular hypervigilance is going to be common and perhaps pervasive among certain populations. If you're less safe, you're going to be at a heightened sense of alert. And again, anxiety turns to agitation, turns to anger sometimes. And so I think, it's really important, as we have all just gone through some pretty awful leadership, and then how we've all we're still kind of going through COVID, and we've all been going through this kind of racial reckoning and this, upheaval that we've been dealing with in our country. We need to all look around and understand that each other is hypervigilant. And so I'll show you some clips, and then I'll talk some more about that.
That's right. There's a civil war going on, only this time it's with good white people and cracker-ass crackers. And the crackers have got to go, okay? I thought y'all would agree with that. By the way, I'm going to say cracker a lot tonight. In fact, I got my very own J. Edgar Hoover cracker counter popping up throughout this episode, because I want y'all to know exactly how many times I said it, so you know what level of online outrage to be at, okay? But before you get the thumb thugging all over Twitter, I didn't invent the word. I don't know who did. But Dana St. Clair, a white man, who literally wrote the book on crackers, and I know y'all love listening to white men, says that in the 1800s, writers in the North started using the term cracker as slang for slave drivers who were literally cracking whips over the backs of black folks. And by the 1940s, cracker became a handy way to describe bigoted white people. Crackers are cowards, by the way. How do I know? Because they always hiding under sheets. Low thread count ass crackers.
White people don't have the experience of driving down the street, and when a police car gets behind them, they thinking, maybe I need to pull over because I don't even want to have any interaction with the police whatsoever because I don't know how this can end. Like, that's just, being black and paranoid in America. It's like you always got to constantly guess if something is a matter of color or if it's a matter of circumstance. Like, that's what you're constantly questioning. Like, did this happen because, just because, or did this happen because I'm black?
Okay, and see, the reason I wanted to show you that was, I catch this guy on Comedy Central a little bit sometimes on the commercials, or he'll come on after something that I'm watching, and I'll catch myself listening a little bit for a second. Now, again, I don't think he's funny. I don't think he's particularly funny. So I don't expect the show's going to be on long. Maybe others, do, appreciate his humor a little bit better. But you see, a lot of it was just really insulting and inflammatory remarks about white people. And of course, I think we've all heard a joke at the expense of perhaps a race or perhaps the white race, and sometimes it's funny. Sometimes it's funny. Some of these more direct inflammatory insults, they're not helping. They're not helping the situation, because I believe that there's other people who are probably less emotionally intelligent and aware of their reactions and are less aware of hypervigilance and hypersensitivity and traumatic injuries to understand. They're going to understand that as reverse racism. And maybe some of it is that. Maybe some of it is that. But when I break it down a little bit, when I think about growing up in a community where perhaps I wasn't as safe, or my mom or my dad wasn't as safe, or my brothers and sisters wasn't as safe, or perhaps some of those people were harmed because of the color of their skin or the community that they come from. And so I started to remember my emotional intelligence when it comes to thinking about hypervigilance. Because as you see in one of the later clips there, he was talking about how anxious black people are. And of course, anxiety turns to agitation, turns to anger. And so I think that guy's doing his therapy on stage and getting a chuckle every now and then, quite honestly. You know, I'm not opposed to, you know, that vein of comedy, but some of it was just more cathartic. And it's great that Comedy Central is affording them that. You know, I feel like some of those jobs are token jobs when, you know, we're not going to give you guys equality, but here's a microphone so you can bitch about it for a while until you get taken off the air or whatever. You know, because his name's Charlemagne the God. Again, I kind of have a problem with the name myself, but whatever. The show is called The God's Honest Truth, and he may have as many people tune in because they're ticked off. I don't know, but I'm trying to remember hypervigilance. You know, because I can, you know, be reactive to those types of insults because some of it, that's what it is. And it's kind of blanket insults that are probably grouping all white people in with the people who have done them harm. Because so anyway, so there's some sharing and some thoughts that I have on that. So anyway, like I said before, there's the slides on the traumatized brain, which I referenced earlier. Sometimes it comes out of my mouth in a slightly different order than it comes out on the PowerPoint, but it's there because I think that science and evidence is important in understanding an injury that sometimes comes at you with some kind of strong emotion sometimes. And so it's important for me to kind of understand that, because I'm human and I have feelings also. So when somebody comes at me with some hypervigilance or some insults for my race, grouping me in with all the people that were oppressive to that group, then what I'm going to try to do is, remember that this is an injury, and we don't punish people. It's not in our ethics. It's not in our values as social workers and as caring professionals to punish somebody or invest less in them because of symptoms of a measurable injury. And so lots of generational trauma that we see. We sometimes can pass our trauma down from generation to generation. We do it through, I think, learned norms and behavior by teaching what feelings look and sound like, and how we cope and how we interact, how we work, how we don't work, how we have relationships. So there's a lot of things that we're teaching to kids based on just what's normal and what's familiar. And I think also there are some instances where we can see that we can physiologically pass down some of our injuries, both as far as mental illness, anxiety. We know that when mama has stress and baby's inside, then baby has stress. When mama, obviously doesn't have, safety and provision as far as a place to be or adequate nourishment, again, baby is experiencing that injury as well. And there are measurable impacts that just, of course, break our heart about that, but there is a lot of trauma that is quite generational. And so thinking about some of our Native American populations, substance abuse, domestic violence, violence against children, against men, against women, and all of these groups, they're just astronomically high. And of course, thinking about, going way back, this is a population that was really, really injured from the very beginning and then left to struggle with one another. We see that in so many families anyway. How often as therapists do you see somebody hurt a kid or a mom, and then they're gone, and then the kid and the mom or the kids are left to be hurt with one another? Well, I see that a lot in a lot of our marginalized communities. And then trauma becomes a learned behavior. It's what you do because it's familiar. It's the data that your brain has come to know. And so looking at that next slide, I like to refer to this mouse study. And there's also another one, I think it's done with birds. But in this one particular mouse study, it shocks male mice and associates it with a cherry blossom smell. They shock them and then they associate with cherry, and it becomes a quick association because experiential data becomes kind of imprinted with other audio and olfactory and visual data. So when you hear something or smell something along with another experience, it imprints some of this data together in your brain. And so these mice become injured by the shock eventually and stressed out. They had a little mouse ulcers, and they would, visibly they were shaken by their experience. And so and then they let them reproduce, and for up to 3 generations the pups, who were never actually engaged with the shock part of the activity, when they were exposed to a cherry blossom smell, they showed fear. they showed this is not a safe smell, and so they had never experienced the stimulus that demonstrated that and made that association. And when compared with control mice, other mice didn't seem to be bothered and maybe even liked the cherry smell. Maybe it meant cherry pie or a cherry to eat somewhere. And so, but these mice were fearful. So think about that, because we pass along a lot of information through norms and direct teaching, but also this is physiological data that's being passed along to these mice. Now, what's replicatable about this? I don't know. We use mice because their nervous systems are very, very similar to ours in a lot of ways. And so, so think about this. Think about the Native American person. Think about the African American person. Think about the Mexican American person, or the Japanese American person, who, because they were here, they were less safe, and that was their previous generation. So when it wasn't perhaps a smell, perhaps it was a white face, or another type of stimulation and so trauma, you've seen the book, Living in the Unremembered Past, or The Body Keeps the Score. Our body sometimes does retain some of this data, and it comes through our genes. It's, one of the things we see, there's no alteration in our DNA. Based on those types of experiences, but we see it through a process called gene expression. For some of you that are familiar with the growing study of epigenetics, that is the study of how traits can kind of sit on top of our already, present gene structure. And based on our experiences, based on our nourishment, based on our safety, based on our attachment and connections with parent, it has a lot of impact on how we function and feel later. And so, that gives me as many questions as answers, though, because think about the fact that sometimes when you feel a tummy ache or a physiological symptom or an emotional symptom that can't be immediately explained or connected to what's happening right then and there, you may be reacting to something your grandma or your grandpa went through. So, it's a real thing to consider, but there's lots of study that needs to be done there. So I thought it'd just be helpful to define marginalized for you guys. I think you guys know it says to relegate to a position of less importance or significance or safety, or whatever it says there. And so when I think, I thought about the root word of the term marginalization, margin. I thought, well, my first understanding of that word was of the margin of the paper. The margin was the outside part. That was on the outside. You didn't write on it. It wasn't the valuable part of the paper. You wrote on the inner part of it. And so, and it got me to thinking about marginalization and how certain groups are pushed to the edges, both quite literally and metaphorically, because African Americans were collected in separate but unequal neighborhoods, and Native American people were collected and condensed onto reservations, and certainly that's a means of kind of pushing to the margins of our society in a lot of different laws. In the development of this presentation, it could have been really, really long, because there are so many different laws that oppress people, and some of them, are still there or have just been done away with in very recent times. So it's not as ancient and in our rearview mirror as we would think. So, so next I'm going to talk about something that hopefully doesn't upset you guys. So I'm going to say this the right way, but let's talk a little bit about Christian counseling. And so I've got question marks all over this, because I want to raise considerations. And I want to first say, so I'm not pelted with rocks through the internet or whatever. I do believe that it is possible and quite compatible to be Christian and to be a counselor. And I do believe that we can even allow our faith to motivate and guide the way that we care for people. the way we love them. You know, and so, but let's think about that a little bit. This isn't some more time for live chat. So, so what do you guys? While I'm not casting stones at Christian counseling, I think there can be problems. There can be problems with it. So, but what do you guys think of when you think of Christian counseling? Hopefully some of you guys are Christian counseling, so you know, you can provide us with the best and most informed definition, because you are one. You know, but I wonder, does Christian counseling mean doesn't mean that other counselors are unchristian necessarily. Does that? I don't think it means that. But what does it mean to be a Christian counselor? So, but it leads me to some questions, because I think it can raise some ethical dilemmas. And so, are we? Is this just using faith, you know, and love to, you know, and to logically guide approved interventions? You know, because I really believe, you know, that love applied logically is always the answer. And I'll say that again, love applied intelligently and logically is always the answer. And so, so we can say, you know what, my faith in God and Jesus, you know, guides me to love everyone. And so I'm going to use that love to try as hard as I can with clinical approved interventions. Then I think that's great. Or are we using it to wield our values? You know, and you know, what does it mean when we put up a flag on the internet or the Facebook group or outside our office says, I'm a Christian counselor? Does that mean we're going to bill for prayer? We're going to go in there and pray about it? I mean, and I think that can be a part of the process, certainly. You know, I think some people, you know, in the Bible Belt want to say they're Christian counselors. Maybe they're using God for advertisement. And I don't know how the Lord feels about that. But also, you know, in the day and age where there's a lot of marginalized groups, including LGBT people, transgender and different experiences of development, does Christian counseling mean not welcome? Because to some it might mean just that. And so, again, I'm not going to try to govern your morals and tell you that you need to be okay with something that you don't feel morally okay with. I'm not going to say that. But, you know, the Christian, I'm familiar enough with the faith to know that it says we're supposed to love everybody, treat everybody good, you know. And so I don't believe, and I'm going to present some data that I've learned that you know, causes me to believe that being different in these ways is not a sin. But if you believe differently than me, I want to be okay with you on that, as long as your belief doesn't cause harm to somebody in the world, especially somebody I care about, because if so, I got a big problem. Got a big problem. And so, because I do have friends and family members who are non-binary in their identification or orientation, people who are gay and lesbian. And I tell you what, you know, you have a mad Jeremy on your hands if you go threatening their rights or their safety, you know, because there has been and continues to be at times treatment under the guise of treatment, and it's actually harming people. You know, I'll tell you guys a story. You know, at a previous employment that I had, I worked at a place. I loved working there, so I'm not knocking it. In fact, I appreciated how supportive and responsive our leadership was there. But one of a patients that came to some of the groups in that mental health center in another town came to me and said that her therapist told her she was going to hell for living with a woman. And that she only had a certain amount of time because the world was going to end December 21st, 2012. And so, she had a developmental disability, and she was scared and she was in tears because the therapist, who you're supposed to believe in and trust, he's got letters behind his name and certificates on the wall. You close the door. This is an authority figure to people. And he was wielding his values. He wasn't trying to help that person. If he was, I guess he was trying to fear her into heaven, perhaps. That wasn't his job. And guess what? It didn't get to be his job anymore. So, I get kind of fired up about that. So I did my best to comfort her, and I, reminded her after 2021, or 2000, the date, it was December 21st, 2012 is when one of the times the world was supposed to end. And, but we got that person reported to his licensure board that he was supervising to try to get to be a therapist, and he don't get to be a therapist no mo. And I think it's important for us to help those along that can be helped along, but there are a few people that don't have no business doing this work. And if we're using our values, and sometimes I think we're human, we're fallible, we can slip, we can, we're judgmental creatures. It's in our nature. But we've got to be scientific about this. And at times we've got to be ethical, and we've got to do no harm. Showing you some more brain scans here. And again, I'm doing this. I say this a lot. Jeremy, it's not because Jeremy said so. Jeremy is pointing to some important research, important data that we have. And what I'm showing you there is a gay person's brain and a straight person's brain. I believe these are male brains. And so I want you to note some things. These are not the same looking kind of brains. And of course, all brains are different, but there are some universals. And so the right hemisphere in size and structure in a gay male's brain is different than a straight male's brain. And in some ways it does resemble more like what we would traditionally view as a female brain in size and structure and hormonal function. And that's important to understand. These are things, I don't think that people determine, let me think, I'm trying to make my brain develop a certain way. We can certainly influence our brain, later on down the road as far as certain habits and different things, but who we are as far as our sexual identity and who makes our body turn on and turn off, these are not things that are an active choice. It is something that is a bit deeper rooted in our neurology. And so I just think it's really important for us to look at knowledge, in particular when we're using a possible misinterpretation of a thousands of year old scripture, especially if we're using this belief system to harm people or to let them have less rights and less freedom. For the longest time, a gay person could not marry. Of course, we knew that, but they also couldn't leave their property to their partner or their loved one, even if they were completely abandoned and shunned by their family. Their family got to come back in later and take all their stuff. And again, what does that resemble? That resembles, again, the Christian church coming in and taking all your stuff if you committed suicide, which did happen once upon a time. It doesn't anymore. So I think it's just really important for us to look at data when anything within our belief system might make us want to treat somebody like less. Somebody asked me, what it means if I can't work with this kind of person or that kind of person. I think we have to kind of know our strengths and know our limitations. But if there's lots of kind of persons that you can't treat, then you might be in the wrong field. And so I feel like racism is regressing, racial relations, and people being willing to consider the experience outside of their own familiarity. I think we're regressing in a lot of ways. So, but thinking about parallel process a little bit, just remember, emotions are contagious. And so if we're working with hypervigilant populations, that can be contagious. If we're working with really angry people that are ready to discriminate and hate, that can be really contagious. So we can find ourselves really reacting to that. So I think our emotional intelligence is going to help us plan for these interactions as much as possible and have a planned way of conducting ourselves. We want to not reciprocate hate. We don't want to escalate, situations. And we don't want to mirror the dysfunction that we might see in injured populations that either will seek to oppress or to seek not to be oppressed and harmed. Because I feel like as mental health professionals, sometimes we fit into some of these categories. Sometimes, we're a part of a majority group where we might not be out there oppressing, but may be blind to certain injustices. And then we're going to be out there treating people. But some of us are also, as clinicians, going to fall into the categories of the oppressed. But a lot of times we're in the middle. A lot of times we're going to be in the middle as far as the people that need to be advocated to and the people that need to be advocated on behalf of. So we've kind of got to play the role of mediation and facilitator at times, and to not mirror that dysfunction and to kind of react to it. A lot of times when people have developed negative or maladaptive coping skills, whatever tools they can come up with to manage through injury, it can be really easy to continue to rely on those maladaptive coping skills based on familiarity and developed instinct. And so a lot of times we can keep doing the dysfunctional dance. Patients and survivors will oftentimes continue to do a dysfunctional dance of injured behaviors and injured dynamics and injured patterns of human interaction. And it can be really easy for us to play a role in perpetuating and continuing to do that dance. And one of the things that I think that we need to help challenge is learned helplessness or learned victimization. Because when you accept that you're a victim, or when you accept that you're helpless and that you can't do anything about a problem, then you probably stop doing anything about it. Now, we have the Me Too movement now. I think, long overdue. But, the reason you had one person come forward and then another person come forward and then the dam started to break, because why is it that all of these things are just now starting to happen? Well, no, they were happening, but nothing was being done about it, so people just quit speaking up. If the police don't come to help you, when you call for help, you quit calling the police. And so there's a lot of women that just accepted this is the reality. You're going to be harassed on the job. It's just going to be a part of your reality. You're going to be less safe. But, a couple of brave individuals stepped forward and said, this is happening to me, and we were appalled, and then we started doing something about it, and then others started to come forward. And it started a movement. Now, I see, just like with institutionalization and deinstitutionalization, there's going to be a pendulum swing. There's going to be a lot of women waking up and saying, you know what, I have been hurt too. And then there's going to be some women that are hypervigilant and hypersensitive, because of that lack of safety. And some are going to say, he looked at me funny. Me too. That's not to downplay the real experiences and the real harms done by inequality and injustice. But we've also got to remember that we're going to be hypervigilant and hypersensitive. And so don't be looking at people funny, I guess. We were compiling data on the measurable impacts of being marginalized in the United States of America, and we would have had so many slides. It was really hard to recognize, where and what to give you on that. I know that one of the startling statistics that I see, Native Americans, full-blood indigenous peoples make up 6% of Oklahoma's population, which means males, Native American males, make up even less than 6% of Oklahoma's population, and yet Native American males make up approximately 24%, 25%, a fourth, according to the CDC, of all of our suicides. This many of the population standing for this much of our suicide. And that leads me to believe, and remember the adaptable nature of our species. We must adapt to survive, but when you have to adapt to to destruction and decimation and eradication of your culture, then a lot of times we're seeing some very self-destructive patterns. A lot of our native peoples are finishing the job that started centuries ago and in their own destruction. And so we see among different marginalized groups are so much more likely to be incarcerated. That's one of the slides that we'll show you. Poverty rates are all extremely high. Educational and employment outcomes, especially in communities where, for instance, on the reservation or in the quote-unquote ghetto communities where there are less resources. The schools are not as strong. Those communities are not supported as well, and therefore there are less opportunities, less ability to thrive. Yeah, so African Americans incarcerated at astronomically higher rates than Caucasian people. And Will threw out a stat, that I found really startling earlier. As far as white on black and black on white shootings, white people are 10 times more likely, I believe, to get away with a self-defense, shooting a black person than a black person is shooting a white person in self-defense. So, and again, these bear relevance in our society today. It's important to think about. These are realities that are not just in the history books. These are things that are creeping up and regressing in our societies. And so I think about these things, when African Americans were, Jim Crow and separate but unequal, was the practice. There was the black part of town and there was the reservation, but of course some of us didn't see the redlining and the real estate and the banking practices that denied people loans outside of some of these territories. Not only was it going to be unsafe and under-resourced, but we're going to prevent you from leaving that area. And we're going to dump our waste in your rivers and bury our trash near your, designated places that we say you can be, American and free with liberty and justice for all. And so, I was just listening to a study the other day, and it was talking about, I think it was Louisiana or Alabama. They just changed a law as late as in the 2000s. It was about non-unanimous convictions. Of course, we know to send somebody away it needs to be a unanimous conviction in most instances. And so black people were being accused of crimes, and they would let a couple of black people on the jury so they could say it was a jury of their peers. And if there was any protest or people that on the jury that said that they were not guilty, that they didn't find them guilty, they would go ahead and find them guilty anyway in what was called a non-unanimous conviction. And you can look that up, and that was happening. And so that was enacted right after slavery was abolished. Now, a lot of Southern real estate and plantation owners just lost their free and owned labor. And so they had a lot of different practices to continue slavery. And so these were people that were put in prison a lot of times falsely and then made to work. And of course, that perpetuates. And of course, there's a lot of systems right now. Minimum wage. You know what? We've got jobs everywhere. People are talking about how we can't hire. Why can't people go back to work? Why won't people go back to work? Why don't people want to come back to restaurants and hotels and service positions where they're making jack? That's why they're not coming back. because people are tired of the people sitting on top making tons, and the people who make them their tons are not provided a living wage. There's lots of forms of slavery that persist today, and I think it's so important. I wish we would have found some case studies, because we can follow families from their time of slavery and see how their family was held back and struggled, and the obstacles they faced with their injuries, and the families who owned slaves. A lot of those families are doing pretty well today. So it's important for us to kind of understand the experiences that is not our own, and I'll say that again and again. So I'll leave those up there, the incarceration rates. I'm not going to try to read you stats or have Will relay for me to relay to you. That's there for you guys. You can see it on the screen, and there's so much. And I just encourage you guys to be aware, because there are some that say, well, black people were freed a long time ago, and what are they bitching about? And so I think it's important for us to understand that this is still happening, and it's regressing, and there's a lot of danger of people losing their rights and their freedoms and their safeties even more. So again, poverty and some of those statistics, and again, I'll let you guys look at those. I'm not going to go over those, but one thing that I'll remind you, any species of creature, when it doesn't have enough space, when it doesn't have enough food, any species, be it human or be it my puppy dogs. My dogs love each other. They're brother dogs. But if there's not enough food in the bowl and they get hungry and I'm not on top of my game, I'm not, if you look at my fat dogs, you can see they're not starving. But I've seen dogs that love each other snap at each other a little bit when one of them's got food and the other doesn't. And he says, you're not messing with my food. So when a community doesn't have enough, there will be crime and aggression and a grappling for dominance, for resources. There will be dysfunction. There will be mental illness and stress-related disorders. There will be injured people doing injured things. And so, there were a lot of people that wanted to justify harm to a certain race of people, and then we put them in these lesser communities, if you want to call them that, and then when they struggled and when they had their injured behaviors and their injured outcomes, a lot of people said, see, told you they were bad. They were less than, and so we're going to think critically about history and race. That's what we've been doing. There's a buzzword out there. I'll say it: critical race theory. Ooh, it's the boogeyman. And so there are, I think, some misconceptions and some conceptions about this concept. And so what I think it's really important for us to remember, first and foremost, the fact that America has deep roots in racism is no theory. And I think whoever developed this messed up by calling it a theory. You call it a theory and that means it maybe happened, maybe it didn't. It happened. We have all kinds of things that we can follow the rope right back to it, where it's, there are things happening to this day that stem from our early deep roots in racism. And so the reason I wanted to try to talk as calmly as I could to you today is because I don't want to tell you how to feel about fact. And so, but one of the things, they're not teaching critical race theory in pretty much any elementary or high school or public school. This is a college level curriculum. And it does examine institutions that from early historical foundations that still have a hold in our society today. Yeah, there are still some influences in policing and other institutions, banking, and finance. And there are a lot of things, as far as women are concerned, women who wanted to be doctors, they had a quota. Some medical schools, if they allowed women at all, they had a quota of how many women they could let in, but they already filled that quota, so they only had spots for men. So one of the things that we've got to do is we've got to just make it about what really happened. It shouldn't be threatening. You know, a lot of people say, well, they're teaching that it's wrong, being white makes you wrong and bad and evil, and I don't think that's true, and if that's what they're teaching, they're wrong. Because, you know, I don't think that that's what we're trying to come away with, but what we do have to acknowledge is that there has been systematic racism. It's not just, you know, a bunch of rednecks in white, you know, in white hoods running around in hillbilly pickup trucks, running around and going yeehaw and burning crosses. It's more than that. It's larger and it's deeper. And so we have to kind of acknowledge that some have been less free and less safe, and that this has had a significant impact on their mobility and their functioning, their health, all these different outcomes in the United States of America. Okay, yeah, and that's one of the things too that I'm glad I remembered to check with Will about, because I wrote this slide but I didn't remember it all. You know, acknowledging what did happen in the past does not blame the present. We didn't do it. We didn't run natives off of their land and then slaughter the majority of their warriors. We didn't do that. We didn't kidnap Africans and bring them to this continent, nor did we make them work as slaves in the field. We didn't do that. But if we do not acknowledge what that did to those groups of people in our relatively short American history, then we become part of the problem. We join and we participate in this perpetuation of harm. And again, I told you, I'm trying not to talk hard about these things, but I believe hard, you know. And I just, you know, I love my country and I love my state. I want better for us. I want us to be able to be proud of who we are and how we are as a nation again. Because I grew up with these notions of what we are, and come to find out some of that wasn't true, you know. So we'll continue, and I'll pat my forehead like a Baptist minister, because I'm getting passionate about what I have to say. We're going to talk about racism, because racism is a problem and it's plaguing our society, and we need to think about where it comes from, why it happens. And so if we look in kind of the you know, ancient roots of mankind, it was actually made a lot of sense to fear people who look different than you, because as far, you know, we were tribalistic societies in our early, you know, foundations. We stayed together and we were only around people who looked like us, you know. And people, if there was another group of people coming towards your territory, you might have to worry. Now, fast forward, I guess when you see another group of people who are different than us coming forward, now we shouldn't have to fear, but some of those old fears are kind of creeping back up. I feel our society regressing. I feel many of us kind of retreating to our corners because of the hypervigilance that's so pervasive, not just in black people or native people, but in American people these days. We're all injured, some more than others, and there's no need in having a spitting contest there, but we need to acknowledge the injuries. So thinking about tribalism, now one of the things that I will say, this American thing that we've got going on, it's unique. It's very unique because, again, while I remind that we didn't you know, do what happened to indigenous peoples, and we didn't do what happened to Mexican and indigenous people. We didn't do what happened to African American people. We didn't perpetuate those things. But what did happen put a lot of different races of people on one continent that wouldn't naturally have been here. You know, this continent was the North, you know, it had indigenous peoples on it. Europeans and Caucasians, we were from a different place. And so, and Africans, they were from a different place. So we're all here now. We're all here now. But the fact of the matter is, racism is kind of a cruel, I would say, joke, but it's not a joke, it's more of a plot played on man. And there are certain people who serve to benefit. Again, people who wanted to own other people found, well, what can we do to own these people and justify it and call it okay? Oh, the Bible says we can own beasts. We'll call them beasts. You know, so there were things that were happening, you know, and there were people who wished to subjugate, who wished to oppress, who wished to injure and own. And they've played us against one another. You know, they've made us think and believe that we still need to be tribal and we need to still stay to our own. And you know, that's not working. We're all here together now. And so it's really important for us to think about what racism is. You know, a lot of people say, I'm not racist. I just don't see, and then they say something about those people. You know, I'm not racist. I just don't see why those people finish this sentence. So racism is about, well, assigning human fallibility. Is that this one?
Well, it's about dysfunctional thinking.
Yeah, these, you know, there are certain forces that are going to appeal to your fear of difference, because we have some innate fear of difference, and we're going to appeal to and provoke that. And so, and when we're racist, we're thinking, you know what, human fallibility, we're all fallible, but we're going to attribute that to race, you know. When people make a mistake or have a deficit or a deficiency that any human being can have, you know, the racist person is going to be more accepting of certain behavior within their racial group, but then they're going to reject or judge or criticize a similar behavior or a mistake or pattern within a group that's not their own. So again, if you're not willing to consider the experience outside of your own, you might be a racist. If you're not willing to empathize and consider, you know, Jeff Foxworthy or that Dunham or whoever says you might be a racist or you might be a this or you, there are indicators. And like I said, if you attribute human fallibility to a person's race instead of their human fallibility, then that might be an indicator. You know, if there are people that you're not willing to get to know or empathize. You know, and one of the things, you know, I hear this, that these problems are no longer problems. Well, what that really says is they're not a problem for me, so they're not a problem for anybody. And so, again, we still have kids getting abused, but there's laws on the books, you know. It says there shouldn't be. That's against our morals. That's against our, you know, our values as a society. And we don't beat our wives anymore. We got laws that says we don't do that, so that's gone. That doesn't happen anymore either, right? And so murder. Well, in fact, we've abolished murder and rape too. So those things don't happen anymore either, right? It says in the law you can't do that. We're going to get you if you do. So why is it so hard to believe that racism is not alive and well and doing harm? And that's something that I have a problem with. But I have to remember my problem-solving voice and my problem-solving responses when I'm interacting with people that may have some of these values. And you know, people who are sworn KKK members who are said, yes, I believe that black people or brown people or Jewish people or whatever people should be harmed and you know, white power, go to hell, whatever. I don't. We can't get those people. We can't appeal to those people. But I believe that there are people who want to do good. I believe that there are people who have good in their heart and that do want to reject racism, but aren't always aware of how they can do that. And what their role can be in addressing some of the problems that are plaguing us. So what's next, Will?
So I'm here to talk to you about microaggressions and the different types of microaggressions. So a microaggression is basically a small behavior by someone else that causes you know, harm to another. Normally marginalized population. So for instance, when we're starting to talk about microassaults, those would be the traditional forms of racism that we kind of think of. You know, people verbally telling you that, you know, you're a bad person, or using, you know, negative names to refer to your racial group or sexual orientation or identity in some way. The other thing that micro assaults focus on could be, the nonverbal. People, crossing the street when they see someone that looks different than them, or, moving their wallet to their front pocket when they're around certain people to try and protect themselves because they, assume that those people are less trustworthy than others. Now, micro insults are more covert. They're kind of the ones that I think we might see more often today, where we're making assumptions based on someone's race or sexual orientation or gender identity. Some people might assume that, because you're black, you're more likely to go break into a bank or something, even though that's not necessarily true. Along with, thinking that, people that are poor might not be as smart as people that are rich. Insulting people because they're uneducated. Different types of things like that that are a little bit smaller and not seen as, overtly as calling someone a name, but it's still kind of insulting. We actually have a YouTube clip that I believe we're going to play of Joe Biden talking about Barack Obama. And what's significant about that is, I don't know that Joe Biden realized he was doing this, but, when he's using, the words, eloquent and, intelligent, he makes it sound like Barack Obama was the first black person to ever be those things, which I'm sure is not true. So that's an example of a micro insult.
You just get the idea that you can almost expect to hear the words "for a black guy."
Yeah, pretty much.
Coming after those words.
Yeah. And then there's the micro invalidations, which I also feel like happen a lot. It could be people denying your experience. Like, I hear a lot of stuff about how, we shouldn't make Gay History Month or Black History Month or, Indigenous Peoples Day. We shouldn't highlight those people's history. They're not more important than any other group.
Not even as important.
Yeah, they're not as important, really. But the thing is, in my opinion, every day is Straight White People Day. You guys get to do whatever you want every day. And you haven't, had the experience of being marginalized by anyone necessarily, unless you're, involved in some sort of crime or, maybe have a gender or sexual identity that differs from others. But there's a reason that we, highlight these marginalized groups, because it's important for us to remember what we did to those groups, and it's important to celebrate that culture that, white culture has for so long just not talked about or not acknowledged. A lot of, I'm sure Indigenous people, Black people, gay and lesbian people, transgender people, people in all these different groups, are less than to the majority.
Well, people who haven't had those experiences of marginalization consider a lot of times, without exploration or sensitivity, they think it's like belly aching. What are they belly aching about?
Yeah.
They've got their equality or this and that,
Because they don't see it with their own eyes,
they haven't
really.
experienced it.
Yeah. But that's kind of why I think we need to have, Gay History Month and, Indigenous Peoples Day and stuff like that, because I think some of those things serve to educate some people. Also, here's a bit of local current event news for you that I feel it kind of relates to this. There's a hotel right now that is in Oklahoma City that has been put on the class and curve in Nichols Hills, which is a pretty ritzy, nice area. Now that hotel is specifically named the Ellison Hotel after the author of The Invisible Man, who was a black person that lived in Oklahoma City, you know, in the Jim Crow era. And so some people are, you know, kind of rejecting that in the black community because they feel like the location of that hotel should be, you know, downtown or on the east side, in a place where that person might have actually been able to go, because they were not welcome in Nichols Hills at the time that they were in Oklahoma City. But then there's another argument, you know, kind of what we just talked about, is maybe we need to expose people that haven't, you know, heard about this person, or, you know, heard about the things that they went through. Maybe we need to highlight that person to a group of people that maybe wouldn't otherwise know about him.
Well, without understanding the history of somebody, it's easy to understand, you know, that they just struggle.
Yeah.
You know, they struggle, but without the history, you don't understand why, and without the understanding why, you can judge.
Yeah.
Now I want to talk a little bit about understanding hypervigilance. Because again, we're working with lots of hypervigilant people. We may have some of our own hypervigilance, and we need to understand that. So, and this is more than just psychological education and forgiving ourselves for being injured. This is really about you know, successfully navigating some really intense situations. We want to coach an understanding and an awareness of the physiological symptom of what it means to be hypervigilant. It means that we're going to be more sensitive to certain sounds and certain voices and certainly volume and certain type of social interactions and dynamics. We're going to need to be aware of our triggers and our sensitivities. And we're going to need to be aware of how our body and how our brain is reacting when we're hypervigilant. It makes sounds sound louder. It makes interactions seem more intense. And we need to be aware of these sensitivities because of what it's doing for our interactions. And so we need hypervigilant populations. They need to understand. This is not, you know, we see a lot of angry people that are not happy with like being murdered and like being oppressed and, you know, being, discriminated against in so many different ways. And so I want to be really careful here. I'm not going to be a straight white boy saying, y'all need to be more polite. And, you know, I don't see why y'all need to burn down buildings and everything. If somebody's trying to kill me and mine, I'm going to try to burn down everything too. And yet, you know, like the guys and gals at Stonewall, they stood up and said, I'm not going to take, you know, this harm and this abuse anymore. And so some level of outrage is completely understandable. But when it comes to just blanket insults against a race of people or whatever, because they are your oppressor, some of them are your oppressor and some of them are your friend and your colleague and your advocate. And so we need to understand this. It's not about being polite, but it is about being effective. You know, it is about understanding and the need for coping. You know, coping is about feeling better and finding relief, of course, but it's also about returning and maintaining our functionalities because that's what it's going to take to fight injustice. You know, we're going to need our wits about us. You know, we're going to need to quell our hypervigilant nerves. And again, this is not about asking permission, please don't murder us, and speaking softly and nicely, you know. I kind of like the opposing philosophies of Martin Luther King, who is about civil disobedience and nonviolent protest. And I also like what Malcolm X said, by God, by any means necessary. And so I can understand and appreciate those things. But when it comes to moving forward, you know, we need one another. We need one another because in order for us to be able to work together, you know, we've got to understand our own hypervigilance and how that's interacting with other people's hypervigilance, because we're a hypervigilant nation interacting with one another in some very injured ways. And of course, I feel like us mental health heroes, it's up to us once again to bring society back from the brink of collapse, chaos, and insanity, because that's what we've been dealing with. You know, people talk about what business do we have to talk about these issues here. You know, we're losing our world, our society. It's getting like apocalyptic. It matters, and we've got to talk about it because I believe we've still got a lot to fight for. Yeah, and so that's one of the things too. There's lots of blame to go around, you know, and most of the most intense blame that we could offer is for dead guys that are long gone, who taught us certain things and laid certain processes and institutions in place, and then set the wheel in human motion and momentum. And so, but blame is often accurate, but not always helpful. You know, and so irrational blame certainly avoids accountability, and it causes us to fail to see what we need to do in our own lives to do better. Black, white, brown, yellow, you know, man, and woman, you know, and all genders and orientations. You know, we can acknowledge what's been done to us, but if we remain victims, then we're never empowered to see what we can do and what kind of life we can actually have. You know, so I think it's important that we avoid irrational blame or a lack of accountability, because it's true that some of you guys are facing more oppression in your communities and in your world, and we want to acknowledge those as injuries and forgive ourselves for being injured and doing injured if we have, but also we've got to find ways to not engage in injured behaviors that keep us stuck. So, what's next? Yeah, so obviously, we're going to be advocates. It's our calling, it's our field, it's our duty. And I think, you know, I said, you know, about changing ACEs, you know, if it's left up to the mental health professionals, we're going to lose the battle. So we've got to get more people on board with, you know, changing ACEs, and I believe we've got to get more people on board with social justice, you know, liberty and justice for all, making sure our brothers and our sisters all can enjoy the same freedom and safety that I enjoy. I can walk down the street, you know, and feel pretty safe. You know, I was counseling a young lady. She was a student at OU, and she met me at a park. My former job, we used to do a lot of community-based counseling, and so it was a lovely day. And she got there to the park early and was out there, I guess, going to read or something. But there was two men in an old truck just leering at her with the engine running. And as soon as I approached her, they rolled away. You know, they sped off as if they were caught. And she said they were creepers. They were creeping me out. And she goes, that was scary. And I said, well, you know, you can't. I started to advise her because, you know, I'm a, you know, Caucasian straight male, and nobody tries to rape me or kidnap me, typically speaking. So I don't have really much concern about walking down the street, because I wanted to tell her, this is America. Don't you let anybody scare you from going to a park and doing what you want to do. I almost said that to this 110-pound, blonde-haired, blue-eyed female that could be picked up and thrown over your shoulder, you know, and harmed easily. So it's really important that we don't advise people with our norms and project our beliefs and our responses to life and try to make those responses everybody's responses. Obviously, we need to advocate. And part of our advocacy is acknowledging generational trauma and long-term impacts of marginalization. You know, this has, you know, there are lingering impacts, and there are open wounds. There are active injuries and injurers happening right now. So advocacy is going to be at the heart of what we do.
I mean, you got the first sort of mainstream African American who is articulate and bright and clean and a nice looking guy. I mean, that's a storybook.
You know, what gets me about the clip that we showed you with Joe Biden, Joey B., you know, think what you want to, you know, that we weren't showing that for political reasons, but Joe Biden is basically like bows down before Barack Obama. That's his big homie. And I believe that he was not intending to offer a backhanded compliment slash, insult. I don't think that he was micro insulting or micro invalidating, or I don't think he intended to do those things. But he wasn't aware. And so I think we've got to actively search for our blind spots, because we don't know they're there, they're blind spots. So we don't know what we don't know. We lack awareness for what we're lacking awareness for, and when we don't see it, we don't address it. And so, you believe you me, Joey B was not trying to go on national television and in one way attempt to compliment and praise, but at the same time kind of say that he was all these things. Well, yes, Barack Obama is all of those things. He's a very eloquent man. He's a very intelligent man. But he was almost suggesting that he was these things despite being black also, or he was all these things and he's a black guy too. And you can see what was implied there. It reminds me, there was a coworker I used to work with, and she had a new hairdo. This was years ago when I could see better. I said, it just came out so wrong. I said, well, your hair sure looks good today. And I said, and it looks good other days too. And all of a sudden I just had foot in mouth. So we can mean to say nice things, and we can believe good about ourselves, but we've got to be searching for what we don't know. We've got to make this an active process of self-awareness and exploration, and mindfully looking for what we're not aware of. What's the last bullet on there, Will?
For ethical clinicians.
Oh yeah. So this is, to keep up with our 12-minute quota on the term ethics. It is important for us as ethical clinicians to continue to search this, to teach this, because it's really important for everybody. It's not just important for us as clinicians, but we set the tone, we set the example. We teach a lot of people how to be in the world. Didn't it make you a better human being, don't you think? Didn't it make you more aware and more conscious? Like your coping and your self-care? Hopefully it does. Because these are values that we hope to, and skills and capacities we hope to teach to others. So we can teach others to look for those blind spots, because I like to believe that nobody that comes to my trainings is a racist. I'm not a racist, I'd like to think, but I can also be blind to impacts from a racist society or influences that have gone before me in my earlier teaching, Anyway, let's keep going.
So, in thinking more about the gender that we identify as human beings, for a long time, we've divided things into male and female in a very binary way. You fit in this box if you're male, you fit in this other box if you're female. But we're learning that gender is a more fluid thing than was once thought. And we can have, people that may feel that the gender that they were born as does not represent them, or the sex they were born as, does not match the gender that they identify with. And so I think it's important to highlight those people, and it's also important to highlight people that maybe feel like they don't fit into any of these boxes and feel like they're non-binary, or they're, agendered, where they don't necessarily fit into a certain gender-specific box. And, there's all kinds of new pronouns out there for people. And I think, some of us might initially have to adjust to that. I think the reason that we're highlighting gender pronouns often now is because we're realizing that we cause a lot of harm when we choose to continue to refer to someone, by a name that they don't want to be associated with, or by a sex or gender that they don't want to be associated with. You're invalidating that person's experience. It's kind of like what we just talked about with the micro invalidations. You're not allowing them to express and be that true person that they are. And so regardless of what you think of, gender neutral terms and transgender people and, gender pronouns in general, and the way that, some people feel like they are non-binary and don't fit into the male-female box, regardless of how you feel about that, at the end of the day, it doesn't take much to just ask someone what they prefer to be called and call them that. That's a pretty small thing that takes about 2 minutes of time for you. And it's a basic term of respect. And I feel like, especially as clinicians, when we're working with our clients, we deserve to give them the utmost respect and to affirm those identities that maybe other people have not. And then, on the next slide, we're going to talk about just some of these vocabulary terms. Like Jeremy usually says, I'm probably not going to read all these to you. I think you can look at them. And there's also, probably a few other terms that I did not put on this slide just because there's so many different ones.
They're changing fast, aren't they?
And there's things changing fast. I actually, I wasn't aware as much of the use of neo-pronouns until I researched this topic a little bit more a few days ago. And neo-pronouns are basically nouns like Z or here or the, that some people who feel like they are non-binary and feel like they don't necessarily fit into a certain gender are preferring to be called, because that also gives them a way to be singular and non-gendered. Since the English language does not have a singular way to non-binarily, identify someone, because the only word that, we can use is they in a singular form. But, that's not necessarily the intention of the word. So I think some people feel that they need to even, divulge a little bit more from that and create some new pronouns for their desired gender identity. But, you guys can research some of that yourself. There's some great articles on there. I remember the one that I looked at to find these terms was actually from the National Public Radio news. So you can be pretty easily, you can find a chart with all these different terms on it. Maybe you post it in your office. The other thing that we can do as, cisgender people, or people that, whose sex and gender match, basically, we can highlight our own pronouns just to make those that maybe prefer to be called a different pronoun than, the majority would be called. We can highlight the fact that, I use the pronoun he, him when I introduce myself to someone, just so they know that that's how I identify my gender, and maybe makes them feel like a little bit more comfortable, telling me how they prefer to be identified. And I think that's pretty much all I got for you guys on gender. Thank you for letting me come talk to you, and I hope that this was something beneficial to your learning process, and I encourage you to, continue to question and learn and educate yourself, because, these words are changing all the time, and people's experiences with these words are changing, because words change. That's what they do. Words are kind of subjective. Their meanings and history can develop over time.
Thanks, Will.
Welcome.
The next slide on your presentation, if you're asking for a copy of it or whatever, I spoke a little bit ahead of time, but those are some of the indicators for prejudice. You can see those there. But if somebody cuts you off in traffic and you see that they're a different race of people than you, is the insult, when you call them an a-hole, do you call them a race-related a-hole? Because that might be an indicator, and so there's just different things. But we'll continue. I've covered But if we're unwilling to consider somebody else's experience, if we're unwilling to get to know somebody else, because if we get to know them, it might be harder to dislike them. It might be harder to judge them, to dehumanize them. So again, we have a powerful influence, and so there will be people that come into our office, and especially kids. And so, do you guys see kids that express racist, sexist, or otherwise dysfunctional beliefs related to sexual orientation, oppressive views? Because you know what? Those aren't their thoughts. That's somebody else's thoughts. You can hear their parents and their grandparents and their uncles talking. You can hear that. You can hear those who have gone before. And just remember, when they look up to you, when you're a big person in an important role, you have some influence. And we're not there to tell them what they should and shouldn't believe, but we can help them unpack some of those irrational beliefs. It's important for us to not, guide people and tell them how to feel about history and tell them why they're wrong and how they're wrong necessarily. But remember your motivational interviewing. And I think that's the next slide, right? So, but there are some questions that we can ask. Again, we don't want to go interview David Duke and the KKK and the Proud Boys and some of these other, bad guys out there and try to get them on the side of justice and right. They're pretty committed to their values of evil. But for people who are on the fence, who wish to reason, if they express certain beliefs about a race of people, I ask questions. When was that your experience? Do you know someone that lives an example of that? Has that ever happened to you? People talk about they're taking all of our jobs. Did you lose your job? Someone of a different race of people than you? Have you ever been a victim of a crime? Because a lot of times they're speaking somebody else's thoughts. They're speaking, we're hearing the echoes of Fox News, and we're hearing the echoes of radicals on podcasts and different things. And so one of the things is, if you just tell people they're wrong, they don't like it. They don't like it. And a lot of times, when people express some really outlandish beliefs about space lasers and, people, all kinds of crazy madness mess going on, the world's getting less and less rational. And those who have thought to divide us are chuckling heartily at this because they did it. So rather than tell people when they're wrong, I think it's important for us to remember too, something I put in a slide earlier, the whole concept of right and wrong, that's a human construct. That's a human concept. There are rocks spinning around through space, and on at least one of them that we know of, life developed or was placed here. And so in the universe, there is no right or wrong. It's just what is. And now most of us do ascribe to a sense of right and wrong, but that is, there are some universals, but there's less and less consensus. But rather than tell people when we think they're wrong, our version or concept of wrong or right, rather what we can do is we can ask questions and we can attempt to lead them to the path of discovery or reason. There was a senator or a congressman that was taking interviews, and he was taking care of his cows and his kids, but he will take interviews and answer questions all day long about why the election was not fraudulent. And he just, every single question, every single allegation, there was a lot of frustration and a lot of head scratching because it would come very cyclical and circular logic for some people. But rather than just tell people that they're wrong, asking questions and helping them, all right, now how is this possible? If this happened, if that happened, now your family has been affected in this way or that way. We've got to help people recognize when what they're saying is not rational, and hopefully they'll come to some of their own conclusions. But we don't want to take the truth and beat people over the head with it. We don't want to shout at people. We don't want to reciprocate the hate. But we want to advocate, you know, and the climate for advocacy is a hot one these days. But that's the task. That's our duty. So this will be our last slide. We're going to talk about identify, challenge, and change. You know, I've introduced that acronym, that little series of words, because, well, it is possible for individuals to change their own trajectories. We can identify our injuries, and we can identify the negative ways that we've developed to cope with those injuries, and we can challenge those to prevent some of the long-term negative outcomes. We can change our trajectory. We can influence ongoing development of our brain based on what we do, and we do need to forgive ourselves for being injured and doing injured. I think recovery and change and navigating this world and navigating the experience of marginalization is hard. It's a challenging thing that we're hoping to encourage people and advocate for people and enable people to do, empower people to do for themselves. But we've got to identify our experiences and our injuries and where our hurts come from and how we've learned to deal with those. And if we're doing something that further injures ourselves or our family or our community, we've got to stop it. You know, we can't let our oppressors win. You know, and as far as us in the world of advocacy and clinical work, we've got to be willing to identify, challenge, and change the systems that are injuring people. You know, we've got to challenge the beliefs and the thinking that allows for people to continue to be harmed in what's claiming to be a civil and sane society. You know, we don't take care of all of our kids. We don't take care of all of our elderly. We don't take care of all of our poor and our sick. You know, so we've got a lot of work to do. You know, and so I'll leave you with a Guns N' Roses quote. You know, because we all just want to have our happy life. We all just want to be free and to have people not bother us and not bother our kids and to have safe opportunities for medicine and education and treatment and joy and love. And so, you know, in the song he says, you can't trust freedom when it's not in your hand, when everybody's fighting for their promised land. And so if you've already achieved your promised land, help others, you know, because we're not there yet as a society. And, you know, the saying goes, you know, we're only as strong as our weakest link. Well, our society is producing many weak links and the human chain is given. And so, you know, I want to thank you guys as always for participating. We appreciated your good comments, questions, feedback, and your respectful interaction with one another, because that's so important. It's becoming a rare commodity. Truth, civility, these things are becoming more and more rare. Just like to leave you with my quote also, don't let your obstacles become your excuses, because we have many obstacles, but there's no excuses. We don't have time for that. And so I want to thank you again for participating. We love you guys and we appreciate your support. I want to thank Travis, as always, for being the man on top of things with the technology. And William White, my dear friend, my brother, for coming and helping and participating in this. Thank you guys for supporting what we do. Please fill out an evaluation. Pay us if you needed a CEU. Don't if you didn't. And we just appreciate you guys so much. We have one more live chat coming up this year, and that's on changing ACEs where you are, and we really hope that you will share that video with somebody who doesn't necessarily need a CEU but can make a difference for kids. So we're signing out, but we thank you guys a lot and we appreciate you. We'll see you next time.